I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Hopefully keep us on time. See a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, so hopefully folks are at least somewhat aware of the project. But my name is Eric. I'm a manager in the clean tech department at Eversource Energy. Up here with Joel, who is also a manager in our sales department. So we're going to go through an update here on how our NY-GEO pilot has been going up in Framingham, and hopefully field any and all questions that folks have at the end. Hopefully people are familiar, but in case you aren't, Eversource, we're a triple utility in the Northeast United States. We cover 3 states, and we've got water, electricity, and gas service. So this project specifically falls underneath our gas umbrella, but we do have the other 2 offerings, and that kind of lends a bit of a unique perspective on things like integrated energy planning, which tie into geothermal pretty well. In terms of this specific project, it's been a little while. I think I presented at NY-GEO last spring, so about a year and a half since I gave an update on the project. At that time, we were just finishing up a lot of our design work and going into bidding the construction work. So we were just about to break ground and start actually putting this system in. For a really quick background here, it was initially a pilot project that we proposed to our regulators back in 2020. So it took a couple of years for us to get from initial approval of the project through things like a customer agreement and running RFPs to bring on feasibility, design vendors, and then ultimately into construction in 2023. It was approved for about 375 tons of load is where we ended up, a mixed-use system that runs through a neighborhood with pretty diverse load and customer profiles. The feasibility and site selection work took a couple of years as we moved through that and design. We ran a pretty rigorous process, helped by the folks at CDM Smith, to kind of look at all of the criteria that we thought would make for a successful project. And then we tried to be really diligent and quantitative about it, because we wanted to make sure that if after the fact we were asked, why did you end up in Framingham, we had some great data to point to and some good justification for this specific loop in this neighborhood. After landing on the site, we went through detailed design, which involved everything from modeling the ground sites at the 3 bore fields that we ended up with, to looking at the thermal flows, the building loads, the electricity requirements, and all of the other fun and permitting that goes into a project like this. So where did we end up? This here is an overview of the actual design of the loop itself. We've got about a mile of 8-inch pipe there running in a continuous circuit through a neighborhood in Framingham. We've got 3 separate bore fields on the loop, accounts for about 90 total boreholes. As you can see, one of those bore fields look a little bit different from the other 2 because we did drill one of them deviated with the help of the folks over at Celsius. So that was another fun adventure to go down with a somewhat new and unique drilling technique there. In addition to that, we've got about 22 residential homes. Those are a mix of single families, duplexes, triplexes. We've got 5 commercial buildings that range from part of a school with about 100 tons of aggregate load all the way down to a small mom and pop cabinet shop. So sort of running the gamut there. And then the balance of the load is 9 Framingham Housing Authority low-income apartment buildings. So the idea was to get a really good cross-section of traditional utility customers. We have every original heating system from steam to fuel oil to electric baseboard and traditional natural gas customers. And so it's going to give us a lot of really great data, both from a pre-pilot standpoint, looking at their historical usage, through a post-pilot, once we put them on the ground source heat pumps, how do they perform? And we can do a lot of great quantitative analysis around things like energy usage, emission savings, performance, customer comfort, etc. So what did construction look like? That was kind of supposed to be the theme of this presentation here. I presented on design and site selection previously, but today I really wanted to walk through what it looked like on the ground when we actually put this thing in, and what were the lessons that we learned along the way, bumps, bruises, and scars included. Main installation was actually, this was a part of the project that was very straightforward for us as a utility. We brought in one of our traditional gas contractors. So RH White is a large construction firm in our area. They do dozens, if not 100 miles of gas main for us a year. And since we're working with the same HDPE pipe as we would on that side of the business, it was sort of a logical fit to bring them in to put this part of the loop together. And honestly, from the customer perspective, this was the most straightforward and easy part of the project. The mains and services went in pretty much exactly on schedule. It was business as usual, more or less, for us. The main difference was our pipe said geothermal on the side instead of having a yellow stripe. Otherwise, very straightforward. And if you see the pictures down below, that looks pretty typical to any utility work that you may see in the street in your community. Similarly, with service installation, very, very similar to the traditional gas work. The main difference here was that we were pulling 2 lines in a trench instead of just one as we would with a gas or a water service. But otherwise, anybody walking down the street wouldn't have known that this was a GEO project versus any other type of utility installation. Borefield drilling. Some fun photos here showing our one of the deviated rigs there and one of the manifolds that we were pulling in those deviated drilling bore fields. This was brand new for us as a utility. Obviously, folks in the room, there may be some that are quite familiar with drilling operations, and it's there every day, but for us, it was a skill set that fell outside of our traditional capacity. And so did a lot of work speaking with folks in the industry, bringing on some of the great drillers from Celsius, from Midwest. I see we've got Courtney in the room as well, helping us out with getting these in and really understanding how do you approach this as a utility. When you're going on large-scale projects with multiple bore fields and you're serving a whole variety of customers, it's a little bit different than a single installation where you have one homeowner to work with or one building owner to work with. So the drilling involved not only a lot of coordination with the contractors themselves, but with the community. All of these bore fields were located either under Framingham city-owned parking lots or the Framingham Housing Authority. And so we were kind of working with those two entities to make sure they had access to space that they needed, to make sure that we weren't disrupting customers in the Housing Authority, to make sure that we were managing noise and water and spoils and all of the community effects that we were generating that people honestly may not have signed up for. There were a number of residents in this neighborhood that weren't participating in the pilot, and they were still having to deal with things like the noise from the borefield drilling. And so this was one area where especially our customer team helped get out into the community and communicate what was going on and what timelines were like and why they were seeing all of this construction equipment and noise in their neighborhood. The last work stream here, building conversions, I don't think it's going to be a shock to anybody in the room, but this was and continues to be hands down the most challenging part of a project like this. We as a utility typically will put assets out in the street in the public right of way. We will pull a service line, and we have a very clear demarcation point where we say, not my responsibility anymore. Not that we don't want to support our customers, but generally building work had been the responsibility of the building owners. And so they would come to us and say, here's the equipment that I am planning to put in. Please pull me a service that will supply enough energy for that equipment. In this case, we were doing everything, soup to nuts. So not only were we putting the loop in, but we were buying and facilitating the installation of all of the home conversions as well. And as you can imagine, when you start opening up walls in folks' homes, when you start going into basements and attics and looking at building materials from the 1920s, the 1930s, like we have in this part of Massachusetts, we found any and every surprise that you can imagine. We remediated asbestos. We upgraded electrical panels. About half of the residential customers had an undersized panel, so we did upgrades for 11 or 12 of them. Even some of the commercial properties, the fire station that is connected to this loop was running on, I believe, a 200 or 300 amp panel for an entire fire station. So we had to get them a new pole-mounted transformer, a new electrical service, a new 600 amp panel. There was a lot of work that went into this that was not just traditional putting in an HVAC unit and ducting. We got to deal with all of that as well. So A number of homes needed ducting run. They went on to forced air systems. We also put in some great console units in those low-income Framingham Housing Authority buildings. And so it was really an exercise of looking at each home, apartment, building, figuring out how we could solve the puzzle of getting a ground source heat pump in and then executing on it. And to top it all off, and Joel's going to speak to this, there's also a whole customer component that goes into it as well in terms of communication and scheduling and coordination. And so just to reiterate, by far the most challenging part of the project has been customer conversions, but the good news is there were none that we turned away. We didn't walk into any of these homes or buildings and look at it and say, it's just not feasible. We found a solution for all of them. Some of them are more expensive than others, but what we really wanted to demonstrate is that this is a technology and a solution that is applicable to entire neighborhoods. You don't want to write them off and say, there's going to be 15, 20, 30% of the buildings that we're just not going to be able to do, because that makes it challenging from a scaling and a utility perspective. Last piece of the system that I haven't spoken about was the pump house. I do like to highlight the pictures here, some of the great interior and mechanical work that was done by R.H. White, our contractor there. As you can see, at the end of the day, it's not very complex what it takes to actually run a shared loop like this. At its heart, it's basically a few circulating pumps and some controls equipment. We've got a backup boiler that you can see there in the front of that photo on the right, and we've got that large 800 amp disconnect that's on the wall back there on the left. But otherwise, we're mostly just pumping water through the neighborhood. We've got another set of pumps that run down through the bore field that is adjacent to this pump house. But at its heart, it's very, very simple, which means it's very easy to maintain and very easy to monitor. That's a great thing from a utility standpoint, because I can turn around and talk to our folks that do instrumentation and monitoring work on our traditional systems, and if they can do all of the annual maintenance in this building in one day, that's vastly different to what they're used to working on with traditional gas assets, for example. So what were the lessons that we learned going through construction? This list looks a little bit simple, but I assure you, every entry on here caused me some headache and some challenges. First and foremost, timeline extensions, they're just a reality of large construction projects. So I would advise anybody and everybody that is looking to do something similar, build in appropriate buffer, because a lot of these work streams affect each other and rely on each other. So for example, I cannot put customers onto the system until it's commissioned and the pumps are running and I've got water spinning in the neighborhood. So no matter how fast the conversion work gets done, it's always reliant on the other work stream being completed first. So you need to plan for that, and you need to try and align your timelines appropriately. HVAC unit construction, I already talked about this a little bit, but just to flag, we even saw things that differed within the buildings from the initial design phase to the actual construction inside the homes or the commercial buildings. A great example of this is getting outdated drawings from the city of Framingham, where they say, here's the drawings that we've got, they hand them to you. You say, great, you design a system around those drawings. You then get in there to actually locate the units and you realize, oh, you've got a pipe in the wall behind here that wasn't on your drawings, or you've got an electrical circuit that we can't relocate here. So we had to do some almost, I don't want to say on the fly, but some very short-term movements and relocations of equipment and units within buildings. Just expect it's going to happen and plan for it, because it's never perfect. Unmarked utilities, another great example. We found quite a few of them as we dug through the streets of Framingham. Again, as a utility, not unexpected, not something we were unable to handle, but something that we dealt with on a day-to-day basis. Equipment replacement, things fail. You know, sometimes it's working at the factory, and by the time it arrives out on site, it isn't working. And so dealing with that and how it can potentially impact things like your timeline. Plan for it, have some contingency. Scheduling challenges, I'll leave Joel to talk about that one, but suffice to say, dealing with 22 individual residential homes, the city of Framingham, the fire station, the housing authority, and all of the residents in those 108 housing authority apartments, it's a scheduling challenge. And lastly, asbestos, something that I was hoping we weren't going to run into, but I was fairly sure that chances were high, and we did indeed have to do some pretty significant asbestos remediation through the project. So a lot of pieces. In a vacuum, any one of these is not such a challenge. When you look at the project as a whole, though, there's a reason why. When we initially went into this, we were thinking, we'll get construction done in 8-9 months, and here we are about 14 months later, and fortunately the system's on and running and we've got loads on, but not nearly the original timeline that we were looking at. Restoration work, one of the final kind of work streams here that I wanted to flag, is an important one. A lot of times people don't think about that, but when you are going into these neighborhoods and tearing up roads, tearing up sidewalks, pulling a service line through folks' front lawn, they do want to be reassured that you're going to be restoring it back to original condition or better. And so keep a budget line item, keep it in mind, because restoration seems like almost an afterthought, but it really is that perception that the community is going to get from you at the end of the day. Your equipment is going to be long gone and somebody's going to walk through the neighborhood, and if the sidewalk looks bad or the street looks bad or the lawn looks bad, that's the lasting impression that they're going to have. So we've put a really big focus on good restoration as well. So where are we today? As of today, the loop construction was finished early 2024. The pipes were in the street. We then moved into getting the pump house in, getting the instrumentation done, getting the system flushed, purged of air. That was a challenge all in and of itself, and it continues to be. Getting it fully on and commissioned. So we had pumps on in June, and then we added our first loads to the system back in early September. So as of today, we've got a good portion of all of the customer load on and actually using the system. Folks continue to come on daily at this point through some of those challenging conversions that we saw, or asbestos remediation work that was just finishing up in the past few weeks here. And then we're kind of going to be moving into the O&M phase of the project, looking at the data, looking at the customer's perception, what the performance of the units are, and how we go through our first winter here in Massachusetts, which will be a very interesting time period from a system performance standpoint. We're looking forward to getting some good design days that we can see how the temperatures look on the system, how fast do I need to run the pumps to support all of these customers, and fairly confident that the good design work will pay dividends here through the winter as we don't have to fire up that electrical boiler. Lessons learned from commissioning, I did want to call this out separately because although it does seem like, getting the assets in and the construction itself is the big lift here, I cannot overstate how important proper commissioning is. Flushing your systems well, getting the air out, getting the debris out, and then making sure, honestly, that the vendors understand the whole system. This is one of the big lessons that I have learned in the past few weeks here is just because you explain it to a contractor and you talk through it doesn't mean that they necessarily understand how the shared loop works. They may be familiar with two pipe systems. They may be familiar with individual installs where they just have a single pair of lines coming into the home. They do not necessarily understand a shared loop, and so take the time to talk through any vendors and contractors that you work with, make sure there's a good, solid understanding there and that you're there to support them as they put it in. In our case, we had a few bumps and hiccups that we had to work through. Nothing that was a showstopper, but it did just really highlight the fact that these systems, especially at the utility scale and being run and operated by the utility, are somewhat new and novel, and all of the vendors that you're going to see in your local areas may not necessarily be comfortable with exactly how they work. The last one to highlight that we also did run into, temporary space conditioning. This was a requirement that back when we bid this project, we weren't even thinking about, but it came to be quite critical for some of the facilities like the fire station and the schools. When you get in there and do HVAC work, it's not a one-day process on these larger buildings. And so if you do have big commercial buildings, public buildings, schools, things like that, they're going to be asking you about how are you keeping my space warm or cold depending on the season while you're in here working. Have a plan for it. We had to do some things on relatively short notice, get some temporary heaters or coolers rolled out to keep people comfortable. It wasn't a huge issue, but again, it's something that you can plan for up front and you can do it hopefully easier and cheaper than I had to do it. Lastly, operations and data collection. This is kind of the phase that we're running in now. A screenshot there from our SCADA that we have stood up for this system, so we can see real time what our flows are, what our temperatures are. We can see what speeds the pumps are running at. We can see energy usage. All of this to say that we really are approaching this as a full utility offering. This is similar to what you would see on a gas or an electric system, and we're hoping to capture more data than we need so that if we ever have questions down the line of how did this perform on this given day, or how can we make improvements, make adjustments, we can go right back to all of the data that we're collecting and make some good informed decisions. Lastly, the design run length of this pilot specifically was approved at 2 heating and cooling seasons, so that means we will be running through the fall of 2026. I'm expecting some good data to come out of that, and we will continue to run and operate the system going forward, but that was the original pilot length set by our regulators. So kind of rolling it all back up, I like to always end on this slide when I talk through the pilot, but level of setting on what does success look like here. Obviously, we want to validate that we, the utility, can put these systems in at the appropriate cost and run and operate them as a utility offering. But secondly, we also want to look at some of the other things like what is the customer acceptance of the technology? How do they like the ground source heat pump in their home? Are they talking to their neighbors and saying, you should sign up for this, you should connect to the loop? Because that's really going to inform us as a utility which customers we can roll this out to and how widely we can potentially provide this as a business offering. Environmental benefits are another obvious one. We've run the initial numbers up front, and we're seeing something on the order of 60% emissions reductions for these residential customers, if not more if they're coming from fuel oil or electric baseboard heating. But we want to quantify it. We want to present it in a nice, clear, and concise report. And then finally, technology performance. What did the model show our temperatures were going to be, our pumping energy was going to be? How did it actually perform? This is an area where we could see some huge upside. If we designed this relatively conservatively, we may go through a mild winter and be able to show our energy savings was even higher than we originally expected. And that just helps us build the case back to our regulators and back to the states that we operate in to let us continue doing this as a utility. Finally, cost savings. I always like to mention this, and I'm sure I don't need to the folks in the room, but we're projecting that ground source heat pumps will be the most cost-effective option for our customers to operate on an annual basis. We compared it to natural gas heating with traditional air conditioning, propane fuel oil, electric baseboard, and even air source heat pumps. And across the board, we're seeing lower energy usage and therefore lower customer costs on this system. We obviously want to prove it out, but hopefully that's another big check mark on the box of why we should continue providing this to our customers. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Joel to talk about those customers specifically and hopefully give a little bit of perspective around how we facilitated that engagement and how we provided this to a number of private parties on a shared system.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Joel Rayberg. I am the Manager of Sales and Marketing for Eversource Energy on the Customer Thermal Solutions side. And today I want to go through just a little bit about the customer acquisition piece of this. Customers do still have choice, so we need to make sure to get out there and make a case to them as to why they should take part in this pilot. Now, we realized very early on, long before we'd even selected the final route, that this piece was a critical part of this project. And why that is we realized we could go out and we could design the perfect system, right? And it could work and operate, just as it should. But if we didn't have any customers, the pilot wasn't going to be successful, right? So we went and we put together processes from everything from canvassing the initial neighborhood, all the way through a communication plan to keep our customers updated as we talked about schedule changes and things like that. And none of them were more important than the other, right? That communication piece has been critical throughout to keep our customers happy, updated, informed, and ultimately decide to move forward with geothermal. So the marketing team put together a lot of pieces on this because our background was marketing natural gas and getting out into the neighborhoods, and let's be honest, people knew what that was, right? So this is a whole new piece, it's a whole new technology. We need to give people a high-level understanding of what this product is, what is this pilot all about, and why should they be interested in even speaking to us. Because we were trying to convince them to do a pretty major renovation in their home. Anybody who's ever done a home renovation knows that it can be stressful, and there's a lot that goes into it. One of the, I would say, the most critical pieces of this for marketing was what we call a letter of interest. So we wanted to go out. We actually had 2 potential routes that we were looking at. And our idea was to have these customers engaged up front and see if we were to put Maine in front of their home and offer to connect to geothermal, would they be interested? So the canvassers went out, knocked on doors, and asked them. And if they were interested, they signed. So that's how we really got an initial understanding of how interested the community would be. And I can tell you, actually, some of them were so interested. I got a call from one of the canvassers saying that a resident was chasing them down the street. And that was because, for a good thing, they felt like they may have missed their opportunity to show support for the project, and they really wanted to be out there and let the people know. And I can tell you, rest assured, the neighbors were all talking. Within 5 minutes of us beginning canvassing, people were actually coming out and talking to us. So a really successful piece there. And another big piece of this is that we didn't just send people out there and say, all right, give it a shot, knock on doors. We developed a full script to make sure that the canvassers had all the right information to deliver to the customers, as well as the marketing materials that hopefully answered the questions that these customers had. All of the canvassers received extensive training on how to canvass. Again, you're going up to someone's door. No one really particularly wants to be interrupted in the middle of dinner. So we made sure that they were wearing their PPE, fully identified as a member of Eversource, as well as we had, and I would say this is probably one of our most critical pieces of marketing, we had a letter of commitment and a letter of support from the city of Framingham signed by the mayor. And that went a long way. So we have the utility out there and we have the support from the city. People knew that this was real because there was a lot of skepticism. The biggest objection we had was, this seems too good to be true, right? There's some person knocking on the door saying, we have this brand new technology, work for the utility. We want to come provide this to you, right? And it was a big thing for us to overcome. So some of the materials that we developed, everything from door hangers, high-level explanation on what is network geothermal, and just telling them a little bit about the project in terms that they cared about, right? Talking about what are the benefits to them, what are the benefits to the community, and ultimately cost savings, as Eric mentioned. Everyone likes to save money. So after we got the interest, we then had to go out and sit down with these customers. Now, every presentation was catered to this customer that we were sitting down with. And what I mean by that is we had a dichotomy of different reactions, right? We walked into some homes and we spent hours there. And that was answering all of their questions and technical, to the point where sometimes I even had to call Eric and get him involved. And then there were some that came and had cookies waiting for us and coffee and just said, what do I have to sign? I'm really excited to get central air conditioning. So the point is that we took the time to understand what each customer was interested in, and we catered that presentation to them to make sure they were getting what they were looking for. Now, the intention of that first visit was to schedule somebody to come out, collect all the technical data, and let us come back and give a personalized presentation to the homeowner. Because while the numbers that, on average people are going to save money or on average people are going to be comfortable, that was great, but people really wanted to know, how is it going to impact me and my home? So we had that data. So on the third visit, after we did the technical piece, collected it, We went out to the home. We gave them the details on their project. What would it look like? Where would the equipment go? Do they need ductwork? Do they need a main electric panel upgrade, which many of them did? All these different variables, and you can imagine there were a lot of questions on this piece, because anytime you go opening up walls in people's homes, they're going to have questions. The other big piece that we shared with every customer was the numbers, right? So we were able to get an estimated kilowatt hour consumption for each project. So we're able to compare customers, what they were using previously versus what we estimated they were going to be using in the future on network geothermal. Now, we did have some oil customers along the route, but the majority of them were natural gas customers. Now, as all of you know, the oil customers were saving a substantial amount more money. But the gas customers, while their savings were less, were still very excited. Again, they were interested in the other benefits as well. The environmental, the central air conditioning, as well as being and having the most efficient heating and cooling system on the market. So a lot of excitement there, and I will say that one of the other things that we did to make things easy for customers to understand on the financial side is we offered budget billing to everybody. So this way, they're going to get a fixed monthly cost throughout the year, and at the end, as long as they didn't add a car charger or some other large draw of electricity, they were going to have a really strong idea of what their energy costs were going to be throughout the year. And this was accepted by everybody along the route except for the one customer. In fact, I think it's the one customer that called Eric, because he had, no exaggeration, 20 years worth of energy consumption in an Excel sheet that he wanted to review with me. It's a very exciting time. So he wanted to monitor his own, but everyone else, they wanted it to be easy. And the customer signed all the details, just stating that we reviewed the cost with him, so again, there wouldn't be any surprises. So the materials for the third visit were different than getting people excited and educating them. This was more about, we developed a checklist for the construction process, right? To understand what special requests, if anything, do you have? So again, some customers wanted to upgrade their hot water heater. Some customers wanted ductwork put in a certain spot. Again, we had to open up floors. There was a lot that went into it. And once we put the ductwork in, or once we cut a hole in the floor, we didn't want to have to go back and fix it. So we made sure to have a very clear understanding up front of what they were looking for. The other thing is we provided a schedule, which what I can tell you is that got pushed back several times. And brings me into my next piece. If all of you can take away one thing from today on the customer side, I will tell you that the dedicated geothermal community partner, her name is Cindy Galvin, this was a critical piece of the project. She was our single point of contact out in the community, and she was communicating pretty much everything that came along with the pilot, from updates, which we've had several, to, well, she also took customer feedback, and this is actually one of our favorite stories here at Eversource, and a unique part of the pilot. Cindy would get texts, and still does, from customers all hours of the night and all day. One morning, she woke up to a picture of a turtle, and a very concerned customer saying that some of the materials that we had put out had prevented a turtle from crossing the street, laying its eggs, and it was a big concern to the residents. So we reached out to the contractor. We said, this is a problem. What do we do about this? Oddly enough, there was a solution. They actually, it's not something that they hadn't dealt with before. On the sales and marketing side, it was new, I can tell you that. So they went out and they built a turtle tunnel. And oh yeah, so the turtle was able to successfully cross the street, lay its eggs, and we got a lot of applause from the customers, and we actually have put it into a big piece of our marketing campaign. There's a lot of turtles everywhere now whenever we put things up. But the biggest thing is that, and that's just one example of how Cindy took what could have become a much bigger issue, and she resolved it before it became any kind of an issue at all. And again, a lot more responsibilities that she has, but that was one of my favorite examples. Another thing we did to engage with the community, make sure that we kept everybody up to date, was we actually set up a tent every Wednesday along the route, and we answered questions. We sent a letter out to the residents, and we said, we're going to be here. If you have questions, if you have concerns, if you just want to talk to us, come on out. We had snacks, we had waters, and I will say every Wednesday we had a fair amount of visitors, people coming over to say hi, people having questions. We even had people from other communities come out and ask, when can you bring network geothermal to our neighborhood? But overall, this was a big success. The city of Framingham was happy to have us, and we even had several of their employees come out to visit us. So there were a lot of other outreach activities, and what I can tell you, if anybody is interested, we actually have put together a flip book of all of our marketing and customer outreach activity for this project. I've sent it to several other utilities. Heat certainly has a copy. It is readily available. If you reach out to Eric or myself, happy to share that with you. But just some high-level things that we did. We had community meetings, so that it seems like a little thing, but these were all incredibly well attended, and people all had really amazing questions. We've done these before for projects in the past, and I will say that these were some of the most informed customers that we've ever seen. The very first one I'll never forget, Eric and I were up talking to the community about the project, the timeline, and typically it's more of a sales and marketing type show where people just asking timeline and how do I sign up, and they were almost all technical questions, and people had done an incredible amount of research, and I just won't forget that because it just shows the level of interest that people have in projects like this. We send weekly project updates out to the residents along the route to let them know little things like what areas of the street are we going to be impacting, which ultimately updates traffic patterns. We send things out on timelines where we are in the project so that these customers feel like, and these are their words, not mine, we are over-communicating. And they've thanked us for it because transparency has been a big piece of this, and quite frankly, why the customers are still happy today, even though we've been out in the neighborhood a little longer than we originally thought. And again, there's several other things that we have done for communication, but what I can tell you is that overall, the fact that we have this communication plan put together and we have put it out there and made it easy for customers to contact us, they very much appreciate it, and we get a lot of thanks on a regular basis. The residential in-home work. So, as Eric mentioned, this has certainly been by far and away the most challenging, and anybody here who's ever done, again, a home renovation project, they can be stressful. There's a lot going on. We are currently trying to manage 22 of them at once, and there's just a lot to take part in there. But what we've done is made sure that during the project, we've done initial walkthroughs with the customers to confirm that all the work that is going to happen, they are aware of. And at the end, we have a form that they're going to sign stating that we have completed all the work to their satisfaction and made sure that ultimately this was a positive experience for them. Now, what comes next after construction? So we have a welcome kit that we have developed for the residents explaining what type of heating system they have in their home, what it takes to maintain that type of heating system. It does talk a little bit about the surveys that we are going to be sending out, as well as that piece that we walk through the customer as far when we're done with construction, and ultimately make sure that they are happy with everything that has happened. So what are the lessons learned? The biggest thing that I took away is how excited customers are for network geothermal. The one thing I want to share with you guys is that every customer that we sat down with signed up. So there was no one that we actually met with that told us no. And that to me was went a long way. As an example, as far as canvassing and customer acquisition on the natural gas side, to canvass a neighborhood to get the level of interest that we got in a week and a half took somewhere between 2 and 3 months on a gas project. And we didn't always get to the level of interest that we had with the NY-GEO in just a week and a half. So, and as far as the customer acquisition side, if we went into a natural gas neighborhood, you know, the average would be somewhere between 40 and 60% if we were lucky. As I mentioned, every customer that we sat down with, they signed up. The only customers that didn't, we were unable to get a hold of in the timeline that we had, which was a relatively tight window. So we're not able to actually meet with them. And some of them have actually already called us back asking to connect. So overall, the community partner, critical to providing a positive customer experience. There's going to be a lot of questions. There is going to be changes. And it is so important that you have a single point of contact to address those. And as we mentioned, the schedule is likely to change, so please, please, please plan for that. And the retrofits are far and away, by far, the most difficult piece of this. But with that, we can open it up for questions. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, I'm going to give you a mic first, and then I'll turn around and see who raised their hand.
Just one or two.
Oh, gosh.
Mine are really easy. Is the system water antifreeze, and is there any design to connect it or expand it to another system adjacent?
Great question, thank you. The system, as of right now, the main loop is a 25% propylene glycol cut, so we've got a bit of antifreeze in there. As designed, it looks like we probably wouldn't need it, but you've always got concerns of a stagnant portion, a service that hasn't been run in a little while. You know, there's a bit of risk there that we wanted to mitigate. I'll also flag that there are a few subloops connected to the system. So the schools, for example, have their own heat exchanger with a decoupled loop. That goes above ground. We're running those at a 40% glycol cut because you have above ground piping. The second part of the question, yes, we actually have a design for expansion on this system, thanks to a wonderful DOE grant that we won with the city of Framingham and HEAT. So that design is pretty well ready to go, and we're just in the phase of looking at what construction of the expansion looks like. That was part of our approach as a utility. We didn't want to design a system that would be one and done and you couldn't expand on it. So that was one of the drivers that led us to a one-pipe system versus maybe a 2 or a 4-pipe system, is the ease of expandability.
Hey, Eric, can you talk about how many man hours you guys have put into the community outreach part of it?
Yeah. Well, a lot. What I can tell you is that if you account for the marketing side, developing the materials, the trainings, and then of course the countless hours that we've spent out in the field, we have dedicated resources that are out there developing pieces. And again, this has been since inception, back in 2021. We have a dedicated Eversource representative out in the field. I mean, she is there. She gets up, that's where she goes, that's her office, 5 days a week, and she's typically working overtime. We have trainings that are happening on a fairly regular basis that I'll provide to different members of my team based on what the requirements are for them to get out there. So we have had shift from our, gas sales and marketing, where it's really become focused almost solely on clean technology. Can't really get in as far as how many people are actually focused on it. I've got 4 or 5 marketing people that are out there. We have 10 associate account executives that all play a part in it. And we also have a call center that is set up to answer questions Monday through Friday and address questions that come in.
I'll also add, just from the utility perspective, I know I've shared this with a number of the folks in the room, but we have a pretty good roll-up of what the total headcount was on the project itself. So everything from having a dedicated project manager, a dedicated construction manager, sales and marketing folks, support from the comms team, the media team, all of that as one sort of big picture, there aren't all that many full-time dedicated positions, but it touches virtually every part of our organization.
How you doing? Thanks very much for the presentation. Pretty impressive what you guys did there. Couple questions. Number one, did you, the utility, did you cover the cost of the distribution upgrades within the home?
Yeah, so the approval that we received from our regulators was that we would be paying the cost of everything as part of the demonstration project. Now, that's obviously not the business model that would probably be in place going forward, but the idea was we wanted to make sure we were removing as many barriers as possible to get the data on what are the actual costs and can we implement this as a utility. So everything from the heat pumps and the building work itself all the way to the loop and the drilling was covered by us, and then we were recovering it through gas rates.
And how did you budget for those distribution upgrades within each home, being that every home's so different?
A challenge in and of itself. So when we initially proposed it to our regulators, we made some assumptions. We leaned very heavily on our internal energy efficiency group that looks at and has data on heat pump conversions within the state, gas installations within the state. So we had a pretty good idea on the ballpark of what the average home would cost. That being said, we came into some homes where it was as simple as let's yank the air furnace and put a ground source heat pump in and you're good to go. And other homes that had a steam radiator system where we have to go through and pull out steam radiators, find a way to get ducting in, do electrical panel upgrades. So the costs really ran the gamut.
Yeah, absolutely. And why the electric boiler?
In the pump house? Yeah. Because we're a utility and we wanted that safety blanket is the real answer. Obviously, from a cost standpoint, going with a different type of boiler may have been a little bit better if we do end up having to run it. But we wanted to be able to say to the community, not only do you have a backup system within your heat pump, because most of the modern heat pumps now will have an aux system that can be included within them, but we wanted a backup to the loop itself, just in case you get on a January day, the loop gets down there into the upper 30s and people are getting a little bit squeamish about, you know, is it going to continue to perform? We have that lever to pull rather than trying to solve it in the moment and saying, how do we fix this problem?
Okay, I have a couple questions as well, starting with budget. Did you run over your budget? And if so, are you able to share by what percentage?
So the short answer is yes. I'll caveat it with a few things. When we first budgeted the project, we were actually projecting for a 300-ton loop. We ended up adding about 75 tons of load at the request of the city and the schools. They wanted a few more rooftop units connected versus the one that we originally planned for. So our scope expanded, but yes, our budget also expanded. We fortunately also had the IRA tax credits that came into effect right at the very beginning and the outset of our project, which has helped mitigate that. But in real terms, our initial proposed budget was right around 10 million. And now we're going to come in somewhere in the 17 million-ish range at the end of the day. The last thing I'll say is that original budget was created in 2019, pre-COVID. So I'm sure everybody in the room understands what material and equipment costs have done since then.
And next question, and they can grab the mic for me when I'm asking too many. Can you say in a nutshell what the legal agreement was? Did you, like, especially with regards to indemnity and working in folks' homes, did the city provide some kind of umbrella, or did you have an agreement with each house, or just in a nutshell?
Another great question. The short here is that we basically leveraged our existing gas service agreement and repurposed it for geothermal. So we went through our legal team and got that approved by our regulators, and it is very generous to the customer. They basically can back out of the project at any time for any reason, and we've committed to putting them and making them whole back to their original system. So if they had an electrical panel upgrade, if they had insulation upgrades, ducting run through their homes, they get to keep those. It's really, really trying to make it as easy as possible for the customers to sign up and participate without having those barriers.
So thank you for that. And then last question, you said this obviously isn't the business model moving forward. Are you able to share some thoughts about the business model moving forward? Obviously this is, a really labor-intensive sort of hand-holding, which seems right, don't get me wrong, exercise. But how do you view kind of scaling up, and making this more cookie-cutter moving forward, and kind of who pays for what in your minds? Thanks so much.
Yeah, not that we've landed on anything specific yet, and the obvious caveat of this would have to be approved by our regulators, but there is a world with a more traditional, for lack of a better term, utility model where you have a demarcation point and you essentially say, we, the utility, will own the loop, we'll own the bore fields, we will run the system, and we will pull you, the customer, a service. Just let us know what equipment you've got and what energy requirements it has. That's one potential way to do it. There are some a little bit squirrely tax questions around that and decoupling of equipment versus the loop itself that we're still trying to work through, but that's one potential.
Has there been any early feedback from the customers now that their systems are operational?
So the majority of the customers, are just getting out the back end of the actual conversion work and all of the disruption. We haven't gone out and officially surveyed them yet. We did a baselining survey originally to get an idea of where they were at before we started the process. We're also in the shoulder months here, so most folks aren't really using their HVAC a ton. Really, it's going to be as we go into the winter here to see how do you like the ground source heat pump heating. And then into next summer when they get cooling, I think is where we're going to get a lot of the really good data from the customers.
And is there a plan to allow additional customers to get onto the system? And if yes, was the ground loop designed for that additional capacity, or what are the thoughts around that?
So the ground loop was designed for the capacity that we had committed to the project, so signed customer agreements. As of right now, we are going to fix as best we can the customer count through that 2-year pilot period. That's both from a contractual standpoint and a data collection standpoint. We don't necessarily want to be adding and removing if we don't have to. Going forward, though, there is a lot of interest in the community, especially for customers that are almost on the loop. They're adjacent by, one street, for example. They call us all the time saying, can you please just extend the main another 50 feet down the road and hook me up? So I feel like when we get to the end of that 2-year pilot period, we're going to have a lot of interest, and it'll give us some great data on how a utility model actually works in practice. Because at that point, you've got an existing running system, and now you're figuring out, how do I add the marginal customers? So it'll be a new fun challenge to tackle.
Hello, this is Sion Lee from Con Edison over here. Have you ever dealt with a situation where there's a tenant and a landlord? And if so, from a customer outreach perspective, how have you engaged with each of them?
So that is a good question, and it was one that definitely brought up some unique challenges. What we wound up doing was speaking with the tenants and finding out who owned the building. And we had several different cases, and we were able to get a hold of all of them. And we had one customer that spent the majority of his time in India. So we did a lot of it online. And we had another customer that was living abroad in China teaching English as a second language. And again, so that one was unique as far as timeline and everything. We had a salesperson on the phone at 9 o'clock at night. But getting a hold of them was the hardest part of all of it. The interest was there, especially, as a landlord, they were excited to be able to offer this to their tenants. It was the biggest challenge, finding out where they were, getting a hold of them, and then getting to understand that this was a real option, not just some, crazy piece of spam that's coming through on their email.
I'll also add one of the other challenging tenant relationships was the housing authority itself. So this is public subsidized housing where we were taking on 9 of their total, I think they have 30 or so buildings in this community. And so there was a combination of working with the housing authority directly and then coordinating access to tenant units, for example. But then also the challenge of there were a number of residents in this community that weren't getting the GEO system. And so we're in there disrupting them. We're drilling right outside their apartments. We're putting main in the street. there were some challenging expectations to manage there in terms of disruption. And fortunately, the housing authority themselves were absolutely great. They're going from all of these units being on baseboard heating to ground source heat pumps, so they're going to see their energy costs drop by about 75% for those buildings, which is a pretty big benefit. But it was a lot of hassle to manage, and so that was a really key part of that part of the project.
I could just add one more thing. I think that reaching out to those customers from a communication standpoint, the ones that actually hadn't signed up for GEO, was so critical. They made up a lot of the people that actually showed up to our community meetings because their lives were being impacted and they weren't ultimately seeing the benefit. So that was a big piece.
Hi. Hi, I'm Raina Cohen. I work at the Climate Jobs Institute at Cornell University. I don't know if you've heard of us, but a little louder. Okay. I'm Raina Cohen. I work at the Cornell Climate Jobs Institute. And one of the things that we're really considering, especially in U-10s, is how it could be a glide path for some of our union members. And I'm just wondering about union engagement on the construction side of the project, and also like considering that you've collected the IRA tax credits, kind of thinking about the prevailing wage incentives and the apprenticeship utilization incentives, and just thinking about how that factored into your work.
Yep. So we did bid all of our work out at prevailing wage with apprenticeship requirements so that we were sure we met those IRA requirements. We actually went into construction prior to the guidance being issued. So I think either way we would be eligible, but I wanted to cover all bases there. This is actually something we as the utility have engaged with our own internal unions as well, because there is always that question of workforce and transition. And fortunately, we've seen a lot of cross-skilling availability from our traditional workforce to what we're planning going forward. So some examples of that are we now have our own folks doing markouts, doing GIS work. We just directly leveraged those groups from within the utility and essentially trained them to also work on geothermal systems. Our construction itself was totally bid out to third parties, so we had some work streams that were done by union labor, others that were not, but again, everything was done at prevailing wage. And going forward, we're working through what that looks like with our own trade unions and how those agreements work for, are we using Eversource workforce to come out and do maintenance and repairs, for example? Are we having them do the monitoring and the SCADA work? Are we having them do new construction? And so no clear decisions have been made there yet, but we're thinking about it for iteration 2, 3, et cetera.
Can I add something? The Pipefitters Union in Minnesota has very publicly come out in support of this, yeah. The Pipefitters Union in Minnesota has come out very publicly to support U10 work. They see it as a lifeline of their business.
We'll make it quick.
Thanks, Max. Hey, Eric. Nice work. Will Lang with Water Furnace. I won't hold you to this, and I won't quote you, but you did it. You did your moonshot. What's it going to take to do the second shot? Relatively, is it going to be 30% easier, or 50%? Like, what are the gains now that you've learned all these lessons? How much easier will it be?
I don't know that I can give you an exact percentage, but I've got a laundry list of improvements that I can make the next time around. And for me, the goal is going to be, we've demonstrated that we can do this. Now, how do I drive costs down? How do I do this more efficiently? Because ultimately, if it's a utility offering, we have to be able to say that we are responsibly providing this to our customers as an additional business line and not, driving up costs unnecessarily on our ratepayers. And so I'm looking at, how can I be more efficient in my scheduling? How can I be more efficient with my equipment planning and my ordering? And where can we optimize costs to really demonstrate that if project 1 cost me X, project 2 can cost me 75% or 60% of X. And if we can demonstrate that cost curve, it's going to go a long way to pushing forward, this as a utility offering versus just a one-off project. 60%. Don't quote me. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure. And any questions, feel free to reach out.